Okay, we're live. Hi everybody. Welcome back to my living room. Today I want to talk to you about tracking your board straight or steering your board. This would be part 3. So we looked at weight distribution between your 2 feet and also on your feet, whether your weight's forward on your toes or in the middle of your feet or back on your heels, and then the distribution between feet. And then we looked at paddling close to the rail. And the reason weight distribution was important was we wanted to keep our weight evenly distributed between both feet so that we weren't leaning the rail by accident when we were trying to get our body out over the side of the board. I guess I should put the chair away and actually get on my board here that I have in my living room here. And just review that. So we were talking last time about paddling close to the rail, and in order to do that, you kind of had to get your upper body out over the water. So you wanted your paddling side shoulder hanging over the rail, you wanted your head hanging over the rail, you wanted your top shoulder sort of stacked above your bottom shoulder, you wanted your blades squared up where your top hand's over your bottom hand, and you wanted the side of the blade right there tucked right up against the rail of the board or the side of the board where the board gets narrow towards the front of the board. Okay, so you wanted to be in this position, but you wanted to have the weight distributed evenly between your left foot and your right foot when you did it so that your board was sitting nice and level. And then as you pulled, your weight piled onto the paddle through the stroke, and then of course it unloaded off the paddle again at the end of the stroke, and you're set back up again for the next stroke. And that whole time when your body weight's going out over the water and onto the paddle, and then coming back into the board in the recovery, your weight is staying evenly distributed between both feet so that your board's not wobbling back and forth. There is going to be some wobble if you're doing this in rough water, of course, but you sort of absorb the wobble with your lower legs and keep your hips and upper body moving in the normal rhythm, and you basically are running a level board as much as you can, despite the chatter that comes from the choppy water. But your weight is distributed evenly between both feet. But what we want to look at today is the second steering skill I wanted to show you, which is foot steering, or leaning your board to help you steer. And if we're going to be leaning our board, we're going to accomplish that by putting more weight on one foot or the other, and getting one rail to sink down in the water, the other one to come up, okay? And so we want to do that by design. We don't want it to be random. We want that to be by design, as much as we need it to be and no more. And we want to know that we can, go a long way over to really help with steering correction, or just a little bit to make a slight adjustment to it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. When do you want to use leaning the board to steer? Well, if you're already paddling close to the rail, or even paddling, we showed you how you could paddle, like you get your body out over the water even more and paddle kind of underneath the board or underneath the rail. That's really going to minimize the turning effect. But it's not likely that alone to bring a board that's wandering to the opposite side back to the paddling side. This is the type of thing that minimizes the amount of turning to the opposite side that's going to occur as you paddle stroke after stroke after stroke. But it's not the kind of thing that alone is likely to bring the board back. If it's already started to wander to the opposite side, it's not the type of thing that's going to bring it back. You're going to have to double that up with the skill I'm showing you today, or the skill I'm showing you today and a third skill that I'll show you next time. So leaning your board. When I paddle Canoe, those C1s are 17 feet 7 inches long. They're made to travel in a straight line fast on perfectly flat water, and they're not really maneuverable. They don't turn real easily. They're made to go straight. Some races that we used to do, long distance races, involve turning around buoys. And so when you're turning one of those things around buoys, you can't walk to the back and do a buoy turn like you can on a stand-up paddleboard. You've got you're basically trapped in your high kneel position when you're in your canoe, paddling only on one side. You can't get up and walk around. So from this position, if you wanted to do a turn, and the turns in our races were always right shoulder turns or right to left, sorry, left shoulder turns or right to left. So, and I paddle on the right, so what I would do to turn is I would just take my front foot and I would just slide it over from the middle of the boat to the side of the boat. I just sort of climb the sidewall of the boat a bit, and that would drop the paddling side gunwale down to the water. So my boat would be on a tilt like that. And then what I do is I put my blade in close to the side of the boat at the front, and I paddle wide like a sweep stroke. And as I did that, it would turn my boat pretty quickly to the opposite side, and that would help me get around the buoy. The other time that I used my foot, moved my foot and leaned my boat to help me steer was when I was wash riding, which we call drafting in stand-up paddling. And the place where we draft the most or wash ride the most in sprint canoe is on the side wash. So there would be a boat in front of you over here, and you would be perched on their side wave, the wave that comes off the nose of the boat in front of you, and you'd be paddling. And of course, you can't change sides to steer, and so you'd be paddling and you'd be steering, you know, at the end of the stroke a bit, or you know, going a little bit under the boat, a little bit wide from the boat, that type of thing. But the other thing you could do is you could just move your front foot over to one side or the other a little bit, and just get a little bit of a lean here or there when you needed it to your boat, and that would help it move and steer to stay on the wave better. And so, just like in stand-up paddling, when we're drafting, that's a time when we, you know, can use little tricks to make steering corrections, and foot steering in stand-up paddling is a really good, useful skill for making those little corrections while you're drafting. So we'll look at foot steering now. And the reason it works is just like in the canoe, which has a really sharp nose, a piercing nose, displacement hull paddleboards have a piercing nose. And even the boards that look like a starboard ace or an all-star, where they have that bulbous nose at the front, even that bulbous nose is more like a boat in the way it reacts with the water than a planing board, like a surfboard, which you know, flat with sharp rails. And so if you want to correct the steering of your board, you can use the rails at the front of the board and the piercing nose to make your board, if you lean it, run one way or the other. And the interesting thing is that if you are come from a surfing background, a snowboarding background, or a skateboarding background, the leaning is going to be counterintuitive to you, right? So on a skateboard, a snowboard, or a surfboard, if you want to turn, basically you lean your board, or you carve the rail, you make the rail bite on the side that you want to turn to. So if I wanted to turn to the right, I would weight the right rail and I would turn towards the weighted rail, right? Our displacement hull boards and my sprint canoe work the opposite way. Remember, I told you I paddled on the right in my sprint canoe, right? And I would lean the right side, which would help me turn to the left. Okay, so it's exactly opposite from a paddleboard, or sorry, a surfboard, a skateboard, or a snowboard. And paddleboards with displacement hulls, they behave the same as my sprint canoe. And so what you would do, if you want to turn to the, if I want to turn to the right, when I'm paddling on the right, I have to weight the opposite rail. So it's exactly opposite to the skateboard or the snowboard or the surfboard. The only time that your displacement hull paddleboard behaves like a surfboard, a skateboard, a snowboard is if you are downwinding and you're standing way back on the tail of your board, and you've got those nice sharp rails at the back of your board now, and now it behaves like a surfboard. So the nose is up out of the water, the rounded rails at the front are up out of the water, and it's those sharp cutting rails at the back of the board, and now it behaves like a surfboard. If I want to turn to the right, when I'm standing at the back of the board, I lean the board to the right and I carve to the right. And if I want to go to the left, then I lean my board to the left and I carve to the left, right? But at all other times, it behaves like that sprint canoe. Okay, so this is a confusing thing for people who come from a skateboarding, a snowboarding, or a surfing background, is it's opposite to what you're used to. But it's a pretty good tool for steering. The one thing that is crucial is you need to be moving. It won't make you your board turn one way or the other, or the nose go one way or the other if you're standing still. And the faster you're going, the more leaning your board is going to help. And of course, the more you lean your board, the more it's going to help too. Just as an illustration, last year, about this time of year, I was in Hawaii and on Maui, and I was training with Connor and Ryan Funk, and we're doing some work in harbor in Kailui, and we're going, which is flat water predominantly, and so we're going around some buoys that, shipping buoys that are in the harbor. We're using them as turns for the course, and a couple of the buoys were 90 degree or not even 90 degree turns, so they weren't super sharp turns, and you didn't have to step back and do a pivot turn to get around those buoys. You could just basically keep paddling and get around those buoys. And I saw Ryan turn his board really quickly, really sharply, just by leaning the board. And I've never seen somebody lean their board so much to do a turn. He had the side. He was on a 22.5 All-Star, and he must have had the side under the water, and he turned right to the paddling side, no problem. So he was paddling on the right, and he did a right hand turn without changing sides, just by leaning his board, and it turned like really quickly. So it's a really powerful steering tool if you use it aggressively, and if you use it less aggressively, it's a good tool to use in conjunction with paddling close to the rail or even paddling under the rail. And the next skill I'm going to show you in the next video, you can use it in conjunction with them, and it works really well to correct your steering as well. Or if it's just a small correction, just a little bit of lean sometimes, like when you're drafting, can just help your nose slide to where you want it to be. So how do you lean your board? Well, the first thing I think that's worthwhile doing is practicing on your board, just leaning your board and getting used to the secondary stability of your board, right? I'll talk about this more in a video that I'll do on stability on paddle boards. I'll do a video on some SUP stability tips just to help people who feel like a little shaky when they get into rough water, that type of thing. So we will talk about primary and secondary stability then, but one of the things to know is that your board has the primary stability, which is the initial twitchiness that you feel when you get on it. So you hop on a new board for the first time and it feels a little shaky. That's the primary stability. But even though it may feel a little shaky, a little wobbly, you'll find that every board has a point where it will lean and then it'll stop. And it's really hard to make it go any further, tip over any further than that point. And that point is this point of secondary stability. So one thing I'd suggest you do is, I guess on a warm day, where you don't worry about falling in, is get out on your board, just stand near the beach or near the dock, and just practice weighting one rail, putting all your weight onto one foot, weighting the other rail, and see how far down into the water you can weight that rail. If you're paddling on a dugout, see if you can get the board so far over that water starts coming in over the side. Okay, just see how far you can lean your board. And what you'll find is that you can lean your board a long way over and it'll stop, like it'll literally stop. And you reach a point where you've really got to work to get it to go further. You almost have to bring your inside foot and put it on the rail as well to get it to go over, right? And if you think about it, most of the times when you fall off your paddleboard, you're not flipping. Like it's not like a canoe where it flips over upside down, or a kayak, right? It's usually what happens is it leans a bit and your body weight gets outside of your base of support, like your center of mass gets outside your base of support, and you fall off, and you end up, most people sort of end up jumping off their board, and the board stays upright. So it's worth remembering that you have a lot more stability than you think. And when we're foot steering, it's useful to practice that, because it's unlikely that you're going to use go all the way over to the point of secondary stability like Ryan did that day and do a really sharp turn. You don't usually need that, just to help keep your board tracking straight when you're paddling and don't want to change sides to steer. but you need to lean your board a little bit. And you need to be comfortable leaning that board a little bit and still paddling. And one of the things I've found in clinics and at training camps is when you're teaching steering, a lot of people have trouble weighting the opposite rail and still paddling. And I think the reason that they have trouble is that they're just a little bit uncertain about their weight distribution. So they're not practiced well at putting more weight onto one foot or the other foot. And the second reason is they're a little reluctant to trust the secondary stability of their board. And so if you become familiar with that secondary stability, and we've already talked about weight distribution and practiced it a little bit, it really opens things up and makes things easier for you to do foot steering. So if I'm going to paddle on the right side, right, my board, no matter how close to the rail I get, is eventually going to start to wander to the left, right? It's inevitable, because even though I'm hugged up right up against the rail every stroke, I'm still, that far from the center line of the board. So each stroke, in addition to moving my board forward, is creating a turning effect to the opposite side, to the left side in this case. So my board is going to wander. So I'm going to have to do something to bring it back to the right if I want to stay on the paddling on the right side, or I'm just going to have to change sides and start paddling on the left to bring it back to a straight course. And like I said at the outset of these videos, I'm a firm believer that you should change sides when you want to change sides because you're tired, change sides because it gives you some tactical advantage, not changing sides because you have to change sides to track your board straight, right? So what we can do then is if we're paddling close to the rail and our board is still wandering to the opposite side, we need to pull out a second board tracking tool or steering tool. And so the one we're going to do today is weighting your opposite rail. So what we've been doing to this point is we've been keeping our weight distributed evenly between our left and our right foot. We've been getting out over the water and close to the rail, right? Well, now what we're going to do is we're going to change that weight distribution, and we're going to put more on our opposite foot, okay, or our inside foot, right? Inside as opposed to the paddling side foot, okay? So this is evenly distributed. That's more weight on my paddling side foot, okay? So you can just put the paddle down and you can practice, go back to just practicing weight distribution again, right? We had forward on our toes, okay? And again, when I say on our toes, I don't mean that you're up on tippy toes. I just mean that more weight is on your toes than on your heels. You can have your weight evenly distributed across the length of your foot, or you can have the weight a little bit more back on your heels, and you feel unstable that way. Okay, so there it is from the side. Weights forward a little bit weights on our toes, okay? More on our toes than our heels. My heels are still on the floor. You can see I have a very definite lean in my body, a definite forward lean. That's what we want, because that helps us get weight on the paddle when we put the blade in the water. Standing up perfectly straight like we do most of the time on land. Weights distributed across evenly across the length of my foot here. And then weight on my heels, so I'm a little bit back on my heels, and it doesn't take much to feel like you're going to fall backwards, right? And then there was weight distributed more on one foot than the other, so weight distributed evenly between both feet, left and right is the same. More on the right foot, more on the left foot. Okay, now if you'll notice when I'm doing it right now, I'm leaning my whole body to get weight onto my right foot, leaning my whole body to get weight on my left foot, and I don't necessarily want to lean my whole body like that, okay? I don't want to, remember, if I'm paddling on the right side here, I'll grab my paddle again. If I'm paddling on the right side, I want my upper body out over the water. I want my paddling side shoulder hanging outside the rail over the water. I want my head over my shoulder. I want my top hand over my head, and my shoulder, definitely my top shoulder, definitely above my bottom shoulder, my shoulder stacked. And in this position, I want my weight evenly distributed between 2 feet. But if I'm going to use foot steering and I'm going to weight the opposite rail here to help bring a board that's wandering to the opposite side back to the paddling side, I can't use my upper body. I can't lean with my upper body and be in this position, right? That would make me be like this, and then I end up paddling wide from the board, and that's the worst thing I can do to try to to get my board to go to the paddling side. I'm creating no power when I do this, and I'm actually paddling wide from the board or doing a sweep stroke, and I'm going to accelerate the turning to the left when I'm paddling on the right, okay? So what we have to do is we have to figure out a way to get weight, if I'm paddling on the right, to get weight on my left foot without my body, my upper body, going to the left, okay? If you're paddling on the left, you need to find a way to get weight on your right foot without your upper body going to the right, all right? So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to bend somehow or other at our hips to keep our upper body where it's supposed to be out over the water, but get our weight over the opposite foot, okay? And the easiest way to do that is instead of leaning from your foot and going all the way up, right up, you know, like my whole body has a lean now, right? My whole body is leaning on an angle like that, right? I'll use my paddle to illustrate it. That's quite an angle. We want our body to be straight. We just want the weight to be more on one foot than the other. So that's got to come from slumping our hips sort of to one side and putting more weight on one side, one foot, than the other foot. And we've all stood like this before. This is the way kids stand in the schoolyard when they're trying to be cool, right? Put their hands in their hips and they kind of put all their weight in one foot, right? This foot's got nothing on it, and this foot's got everything on it. You kind of thrust your hips out to the side, and through your hips, right? Through your hips, you're putting more weight on one foot than the other. So right now, all my weight pretty much is on my right foot, hardly any on my left. When you get tired of standing like that, you know, when you're cool in the schoolyard, you shift your foot, and now almost all my weight is on my left foot, and my right foot's got nothing on it, right? The cool in the schoolyard stance. We all did this when we were kids. We probably do it now. We don't even realize we're doing it, right? And you kind of alternate between feet like that as you get tired. Just think of the times when you've been standing around, you don't have a chair, and you're standing there having a prolonged conversation with somebody, and how often you switch stance like that, right? Well, we want to call on that same kind of stance and that same shift in body weight, or the same change in weight distribution between left foot and right foot when we're on our board paddling. So we'll pick up our paddle again and we'll get into our paddling position that we want to be in when we're paddling close to the rail and trying to generate maximum force in the blade. So my blade's squared up, my shoulder, paddling side shoulder is hanging out over the water, my head's out over the water, my top hand is over my bottom hand, my top shoulder is still inside the board, but it's awfully close to the rail of the board, right? And it's definitely above my paddling side shoulder, so we call this like shoulder stack position. And so here I am, all squared up, ready to go, but my weight is evenly distributed between 2 feet, okay? So this is the way I'm paddling, but my board is starting to wander, because I'm paddling the right, it's starting to wander to the left. I want to bring it back to the right without changing sides. All I do is put a little bit more weight onto my left foot and sink that left rail into the water a bit, okay? So all I did was just watch my hips. I just went and I sort of slumped them over to the side, just like I do when I'm in that stance that's too cool for the schoolyard, right? Okay? So I'm in this position, I just kind of thrust my hips out to the side, and when I do that, more weight is going down my left leg to my left foot, and my right foot now has much, much less weight on it. And as soon as I do that, my left rail sinks down, and when my left rail sinks down, if my board has speed and I'm paddling close to the rail, it starts to bring my board slowly back to the paddling side. And if I stay in that stance and continue to paddle close to the rail, it will go from wandering to the left to straight, and it'll actually start to run to the right. Okay, and obviously we're talking about doing this to start with anyway in calm water, because wind adds an element to this that makes things more difficult. It can help you or it can make things more difficult. So you start this in super calm water. Okay. Now, what we can do to really accelerate the effect of leaning our board, okay, is we can get like a big lean. So that just means we put even more weight on our paddling, on our inside foot, our opposite side foot, okay? And we can go from being close to the rail, like this, we can go under the rail, so we can, more weight is on that left foot, okay? Like I kind of slumped my hips out to the side and put more weight down that left leg, and I went from squared up to underneath the board. And so now my board, think about it, I showed you this last time going underneath the board when we were talking about paddling close to the rail. I showed you how you could go further and you could go underneath the board. But in that case, our weight was evenly distributed between 2 feet, right? And so our board was level. Well, now I've got more weight on my inside foot, or my opposite side foot. My left rail is in the water, and if my left rail is in the water, my right rail is up. And you can lean your board enough so that you can actually expose the underside of your board on the paddling side. And if you're exposing, you come up close here so you can see my hand. Here's a level board. Here's a board where you weight the opposite rail, and you can see the board's got quite a lean now. And so, I'll do it down here. It exposes the underside of the board. So instead of paddling, I just got to watch the top of my paddle on the ceiling here. Instead of paddling with a level board where it's hard to get under the board, relatively speaking, if you tilt the board and expose the underside of the board, it's much easier to get that blade underneath the board and pull closer to the middle line of the board as you're getting out over the water more. Okay, so instead of keeping weight distributed between both feet, you kind of slump that paddling, the opposite side hip, your weight on your opposite side hip, run the weight down your opposite leg to your opposite foot, weight the opposite rail, exposing the underside of your board on the paddling side, and that makes it even easier to get the blade underneath the board. And you can do a few strokes like that. Now you don't want to do a lot of strokes like that because that's a little awkward and that's not going to be as powerful as being squared up is. But if you've got to make a quick steering correction, that's going to help, okay? So that's basically foot steering. And sometimes you'll find that when you're drafting, and the big time to use foot steering, obviously the big time to, we talk about, this is really about steering these videos, but I'd say that it's tracking your board straight. Because the most common problem that people have is they start paddling on one side, and after 5 strokes, 10 strokes, 15 strokes, the board is very clearly running to the opposite side, and they've got to change sides, and then they go through the same routine on the other side. And they end up going like this down the water course, which is slower, right? You're doing really well if you can just continue to track your board really straight and paddle on one side, basically indefinitely as long as you want to. That's a real advantage, and it makes it easier to paddle in side winds as well. If you can do that in flat water, you can at least get some productive strokes in, on both sides in a strong crosswind, which most people have, they struggle with. So we're talking about tracking our board straight, but really, we're also talking about steering your board, right? Because anything we're doing here, leaning our board and making our board come back to the paddling side so that we minimize the turning effect and can track our board straight indefinitely, is also going to work to steer, right? If I wanted to make a sudden steering correction to one side or the other, I just lean my board a long way like Ryan did when he did that buoy turn in Maui. He didn't step back. He just really leaned his rail and his board turned pretty quickly. And we can obviously use the board lean to, instead of making the board come back to the paddling side, we can use it to turn more quickly to accelerate the turning effect that each stroke is taking and make us go even quicker if I'm paddling on the right to the left, right? So in that case, I'd weight the paddling side rail. And I'd paddle, and I wouldn't just paddle close to the rail now. I'd just put my blade in close to the board and paddle out from the board a little bit, especially at the beginning of the stroke, to push my nose in the direction that I want it to go. And the lean that I have on the paddling side rail is going to accelerate that turning effect to the left if I wanted it to go that way, okay? So you can really use this leaning to steer your board or turn your board, just like I did with my sprint canoe, right? Where I lean my canoe to go around the buoys in the long distance racing, right? Or to correct the steering when I was drafting. And so if you're drafting on a sup, then a lot of times, you're just paddling along, and a lot of times it's just little corrections. Remember too, when you're drafting, you're not, getting that big, deep, full power stroke. You don't need to. That's the whole purpose of drafting, is so that you don't have to paddle that way. So a lot of times when you're drafting, you're standing up straighter, you're more relaxed, you're just kind of dipping along, and you can change sides here, change sides back, change sides here, change sides back. You can do that, but I don't like doing that because I don't like having my paddle out of the water any longer than I need it out of the water for. Like sometimes you can be in the middle of a side change and somebody in the train makes a move, and then all of a sudden you are a split second behind reacting to it. So I think it's much better if I can continue to stay on one side until I'm tired and I want to change, rather than needing to change sides to steer. And so you can do these little corrections when you're drafting just by weighting one side or the other. Just little corrections of weight change, a little bit more on one foot, a little bit more on the other foot as you're paddling. Just helps your nose kind of stay in that little pocket. That little pocket that you see behind the board that you're drafting, where it looks like a little bit of there's the back of the board in front of you, and the wave comes off like that. It's a little triangle, that you can fit your nose into, and you just stay in that pocket and just feel it running downhill. And the nose sometimes slides a bit one way or the other way, and you can just lean your board a little bit and help it turn on the wave so it stays kind of in the middle of that pocket. So it's a really useful skill for when you're drafting. So that's leaning your board to steer or to track straight. And the one thing I think that we should just mention before we wrap up for today is that when you're making your steering corrections, the sooner you start to make them, the sooner you detect that your board is wandering and opt to make your correction or decide to make your correction, the more successful that correction is going to be. Okay? So if you are paddling and you're doing what every good paddler should do, which is paddling close to the rail, remember that's more powerful, that's going to move you faster in a forward direction, and it minimizes the turning effect. It decreases the rate at which your board wanders to the opposite side. Okay? So that's what you're doing. And then you detect that eventually, especially on a wider board, eventually the board's going to start to drift to the opposite side. The sooner you pick up that the nose is wandering and make your correction, the more successful that correction will be, and the easier it will be, the less time you'll have to do it for. So a lot of the time, it's simply you're paddling like this, and you just detect the nose start to wander a bit, and you just lean a little bit for a stroke, and then get your weight distribution back to evenly distributed between both feet. And then you detect it's wandering again. Again, you're detecting it early. Just a little bit of weight on the opposite foot. Get the rail down a little bit. For a stroke or two, it brings it back, and then you can paddle normally again. Okay, so you're making really fine corrections because you're picking up the fact that the board is deviating in its path really quickly. You're picking it up super fast. You see as soon as you detect the nose wandering a little bit, you make your correction, and it's really easy to bring back. The longer you wait, the harder it is to bring back, and the longer you're going to have to make your steering corrections. So if you wait for it to drift, one thing you'll find is the longer you wait, the more rapidly it starts to deviate course. Okay? So it's initially, when it starts to deviate course, it moves really slowly. But the longer you wait, the faster it starts to move, and the more it starts to move. Okay? So if you wait too long, it's going to be like this, and that's going to require a huge correction. And it may be a bigger correction than you're able to do with these two skills alone, with just weighting the rail and paddling under the board, right? If you wait too long, it may be too much for you. Or if it's perfectly flat water, you may be able to stay with that, but it's going to take you a long, long time to bring it back. And because being under the board like this, and getting way under the board as you paddle, it isn't as productive for power and moving you fast as paddling normally is. you probably don't want to be doing that for more than just a couple of strokes. And so maybe at that point it's better to change sides. But the reason you're changing sides isn't because these steering skills don't work. It's because you didn't do them soon enough. Okay, so that's a big thing too for that people have a hard time with, is that especially when they're just starting off and they haven't really learned how to make these skills, to do these skills with any real bite, so that they really are good, are really effective at changing the course of the board. Again, think of that story I told you about Ryan just throwing his rail really deep into the water and his board turning really quick, right? When you don't feel confident or comfortable enough to do that, it takes you longer. These skills don't work as well, right? And so when you're learning them and you're still a little reluctant, you're maybe not leaning your board as much or consistently as you will with practice, if you wait too long, you'll find it won't work. And I see people when they're learning this get really frustrated because it doesn't appear to be working for them the way they thought it should. Okay, and it's not a question that the skills don't work. It's a question of A, they still aren't really proficient at them yet. They just need a little more practice. But B, they waited too long to use them. Okay, and in canoeing, I would see this all the time too. The longer you wait to make your correction, the harder it is for that correction is going to be. Okay, the harder that correction it will be to do. And then the other thing is that not so much on a sup, I don't think, but especially in canoe, so it would be the same in a sup, it's just probably easier to correct, is once you've made your correction and you're bringing the canoe in this case back to straight, you don't keep correcting until it's back to straight, because what you're doing with each correction is the first few corrections stop it from wandering to the opposite side. The first few corrections stop it, and then the next few corrections start to bring it back. And just like it accelerated as it started to deviate its course, right? It started slow and it picked up speed as it went that way. When you make your correction, it's wandering, you stop it, you start it coming back, and if you keep correcting, it accelerates. And so sometimes what happens is people will end up taking it right through straight, and then now it's going the other way. And then they've got to make a correction by paddling wide and try to bring it back to straight. And if they do that for too long, then they're going to the opposite side again, and they end up overcorrecting the whole time, and they don't steer well at all. They spend, they do a lot of work steering, and it's like they're doing a slalom. So that's more of in a canoe thing than on a paddleboard. I've never myself overcorrected to that degree, but it's possible that you could if you did your corrections for too long. And the other thing I'd say is that obviously when you're paddling, if your head's down and you're not looking where you're going, that's when your board will start to wander. So it's always a good idea to paddle with your head up so you can see where you're going. That also tends to make you come up and unload better at the end of the stroke rather than stay down at the end of the stroke. But it allows you to pick a course and sort of stay on it, because you can be looking ahead at a point on land or a buoy on the water or something like that up ahead of you, and then you can be kind of cross-referencing that with the nose of your board, and you can see the degree to which the nose of your board is wandering off that point, and you can always, that'll help you detect when it's starting to wander much sooner than if you just have your head down and all of a sudden you kind of look up and you've really started to wander off of straight. Okay, so that's tracking your board straight, part 3, by foot steering or leaning your board. And the next video I do with you, we're going to look at the third tool that you use to track your board straight, and that is using the face of your paddle. Okay, so how your paddle blade enters the water relative to the board is what's going to what we're going to look at next. Okay, and again, that's a really powerful steering tool, but it's even more powerful when used in conjunction with the two skills that I've just shown you. Okay, so that's something to look forward to, and I believe I'm up again on Friday. Okay, so I'll talk to you then. Stay well, everybody. Hope you're able to do something training-wise through all of this. I hope that you're well and healthy, and those that you care about are the same. And I will talk to you soon. All the best.